and welcome to this training on trauma-informed care and organizational considerations. This is part of a three-part series for implementation teams, especially behavioral health agencies, on trauma-informed care and how that can be reflected into the CARE Act process. We do have another three-part series that's specifically designed for volunteer supporters. So if you want access to any of those trainings, go to the CARE Act Resource Center and you can find those there. I'd like to introduce our speakers today. I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Karen Hill and Deborah Rose, both from Health Management Associates. Dr. Hill is a nurse practitioner with over 15 years of experience with adverse child experiences, which she'll talk about later today, and trauma-informed care implementation and evaluation. And she has done work in communications, health literacy, and trauma-informed care. Deborah Rose is a clinical psychologist, and she's done a lot of work in designing and scaling initiatives with behavioral health. She has a background in working with social service agencies, behavioral health centers, and care coordination, and she has worked in different settings involved in this population. So I'm excited for them to share their perspective and things they've learned in the field and some ideas for you as you're incorporating trauma-informed care into your organization and into your care processes. So let's take a look at our agenda today and what we'll be covering. We have a first section in which we provide an overview of trauma and trauma-informed care, and then we go into a discussion of how organizational considerations that you as an organization can consider as you incorporate a trauma-informed approach into your policies and practices and procedures, and include some strategies about how to avoid re-traumatization, especially in the context of the care process. And so some learning objectives for you. Our goal is that by the end of today's session, you should be able to describe the types of trauma and how that can impact individuals involved in the care process. Another is that you'll better be able to list strategies for integrating trauma-informed care into your work with care respondents, and then identify some key considerations for organizations when integrating trauma-informed care. So with that introduction, I'd love to turn the time over to Dr. Karen Hill, who will bring in Deborah Rose into her presentation. Karen?
Thank you so much, Patricia, and good morning or afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. We're going to dive into the concept of trauma so that you can better understand the experience of care respondents and how you can support them in your role within and during the care process and in your organizations. Our next training, we're going to talk a lot more about workforce resiliency and sustainability. And so today we're going to be talking about trauma-informed care and organizations. And as always, we like to really have an exemplar. And so today I'm going to ask Deborah to introduce Angela.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Patricia. It's good to see you both. As always, when we talk about the CARE Act, we like to introduce the kinds of clients that we might have worked with in the past or that we might see who are eligible for or involved in the CARE Act. And to make this real, we'll present an example. We're going to talk about Angela. Angela is not a real person. She might look like some of the folks that you're familiar with in your experience, and any similarities are just coincidental. Angela is a 46-year-old female. She's a mother of 2 young adults. Her relationship with her kids are difficult. They live with extended family members, and one of her goals is to reconnect with her sons over time. Angela was raised in another country, and Spanish is her primary language. She's now living here in California, and she's been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, which has presented some challenges for her. She frequently hears voices that other people don't hear. She's often distrusting of people, which looks like paranoid thinking. And she's has experienced a number of adverse events as a result of not only living with a mental illness, but her upbringing and her current circumstances. Angela was raised in a home where she was experiencing or witnessing domestic violence. Often her father was absent, which led to some additional trauma for her. And as an adult, she's been involved in a number of relationships that has exposed her to personal violence and abuse. In addition, having been living with her mental illness, she's had some episodes of previous homelessness. She's currently unhoused, having lost her apartment. And as a result of her homelessness and living on the streets, she's experienced additional trauma, having been victimized by society, by the stigma, and unfortunately, some occasions of physical assault as well. She has been hospitalized recently or held briefly on a 5150, and she has in that period reconnected with an old family friend, somebody that has periodically been involved in her life. Connie has been periodically involved in her life for a long time, and Connie has petitioned the court for an CARE Act. Connie has petitioned the court for a CARE Act, and Angela has since been found eligible for CARE Act. So when we think about trauma-informed care, and we go through this presentation, we'd like you to consider Angela, her childhood experiences, her adult experiences, the kind of adverse events that she's been exposed to, and how you might use trauma-informed care in that lens to support her through the process. Karen?
Thank you. Before we get started, we always like to do some level setting and make sure that we understand and define our terms. So let's talk a little bit about background here. We are going to use the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, definition of trauma. And I'm just going to read it for you here and just make sure that your eyes hook on the bolded blue sections. Trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that an individual experiences as physically, emotionally harmful or threatening, which may have lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So that's really the context. An easy way to think about trauma is to remember it as the 3 E's: the event, experience, and effects. This can be a simple event or a series of events. The experience, this is how it's felt by the individual. And we know that all trauma is individual and very personal, and people respond to it very differently. The effects, which can be physical, mental, and affect people through their entire life course. Trauma is really what happens as the result of these 3 E's, and it can dictate behavior and responses. I also want to remember that our trauma or our experiences of trauma don't necessarily define us. And so for me, this work is really hopeful, and we use a trauma-informed lens and we apply some of the concepts. We can really help people manage their trauma and better understand their triggers. The second definition is the concept of trauma-informed care. So what is it? So trauma-informed care are really the principles that promote cultures of safety, empowerment, support, collaboration, cultural humility, understanding about where folks come from and what's important to them, and equity. And this is important because many of the people that we work with, many of our care respondents, the principles that promote trauma-informed care have really been broken. And so this is part of our work with trauma-informed care, is to rebuild that for individuals. Key to trauma-informed care is acknowledging is that in order to promote all of the types of health, including mental health, we need to try to understand an individual's current and past experiences. And so that's really what's important. And we shift the framework to from what's wrong with an individual to asking the question and asking ourselves, what happened? What happened to make an individual behave in the way that they are, or to present, or to have the issues and the concerns that they have? So just remember, it's more about what happened. Now let's talk about, I've talked about trauma. What kinds of trauma am I talking about? The various types of trauma that we want to talk about here. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of them. We're really going to try to focus this on some areas that affect clients, our care respondents, and that can also affect you, someone who's working with an individual with serious mental illness. We'll discuss a few of the important ones with the understanding that all of these are part of the spectrum of trauma. So let's talk about vicarious trauma. It can result from an exposure to working with a client, with individuals with complex trauma, or actually seeing or hearing of a trauma that's happening to other people and it affects you. There's compassion fatigue. This often can happen with providers due to the chronicity of the nature of serious mental illness, or the chronicity of the challenges that the people that we work and serve with experience all the time. And we often have challenges and barriers to helping people really get the services that they need. This is a risk. This compassion fatigue puts really providers at risk for having a reduced capacity for empathy, and can result in burnout if not addressed and made if not addressed. The third we're going to talk about here is secondary trauma, resulting from an exposure to working with individuals, and you're hearing the stories, you're out in the field hearing and seeing these things, you're seeing terrible things happen, and so those are really the focus. We also want to talk a little bit about insidious trauma. That refers to our daily instances of marginalization, where people are objectified, insults, they're intimidated, their experiences often because of a group, for example, racism, heterosexualism. We're going to talk about some of that later with intersectionality, ageism. This affects our respondents, and it can affect us as well. And so insidious trauma, it kind of sneaks up. It's not as blatant and out in the forefront as some of the other types of trauma, but it can affect us as well. And then finally today, we're going to talk about toxic stress. And that's really unaddressed trauma. That's when our bodies stay on this hyper alert. We'll talk more about that, where our cortisol levels are up. And if not managed properly, really can change us down at the biological level. I'm going to ask my colleague to jump in here and talk a little bit about vicarious and secondary trauma from a behavioral health perspective.
Thanks, Karen. I think we'll often see vicarious and secondary trauma used interchangeably, and to some folks there may or may not be a very subtle difference between the two. Sometimes vicarious trauma can be something that you're exposed to briefly or once. You see a car accident, you're watching something on the news, we're all personally touched by it and impacted by it. Secondary trauma may, depending on how you're looking at it, be that ongoing exposure. You're working with an individual on a regular basis, and you're hearing about untoward events that have happened and their experience of trauma, which we can sometimes internalize. And so I'd encourage folks to think about them in both ways, but don't be surprised if you hear them used very similarly.
Thank you so much for that. I think that distinction is really important, because I do hear people using those together. So, and mixing them up sometimes. Now let's talk about how trauma affects our brain. I alluded to that a little bit, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about it now. So epigenetics is the study, that's a big word, and it's not that difficult. We're going to talk about it. It's the study of what causes modifications in our gene expression or alterations in our genetic code. And so there's this growing body of literature in the science that really suggests that experiences of trauma, particularly early adverse trauma, what happens to us at a very early stage as our brain is developing, can actually change us, change the biology of our brains. It can change it physically. And so that's really important. These stress hormones and hyperarousal are thought to shorten telomeres in our brains. And so what now is a telomere? A telomere are structures that actually are caps on the end of DNA sequences and proteins found at the ends of chromosomes. And these caps are meant to protect the chromosome. And as they shorten, it makes us more at risk for instability, keeps us difficulty in learning, maybe monitoring our own behaviors. The thing that's really helpful for me is helpful and hopeful is that we can actually learn how to control some of our cortisol. We can learn there are methods that we can reduce our cortisol, and there's some things that we can really do, deep breathing and exercise and rest and those sorts of things that can help restore our brains and reduce the cortisol. So trauma, unaddressed trauma, weakens and decreases those neural connections in the brain, specifically connections that impact an individual's learning and reasoning. And so this is why it's so essential for us to pay attention to that and to better understand the stress response and some adaptive behaviors that are often misunderstood. So let's look at stress response. So we want to talk about that fight, flight, or freeze. And that's when our cortisol sort of goes into action. That's our primal mechanisms to protect ourselves. If we don't know about the biology of trauma and how we react when a system is activated, it's easy to misunderstand a stressful event. And sometimes inadvertently, organizations can re-traumatize individuals and they get into that fight, flight, or freeze. So sometimes we'll see somebody who has an activated cortisol system, and we may mislabel them as being non-compliant or combative when they want to fight around something, when they're really trying to protect themselves, right? When individuals don't engage or they run away or they're not communicative with us, we may mislabel that as they just are checking out emotionally and they're not concerned about that. We often mislabel that when we can understand now that it might be their flight response that's making them leave a situation that's feeling very uncomfortable. They're really trying to protect themselves. And then there's that freeze. Many of us have had individuals in front of us and you're giving them information and they're just sort of sitting there kind of numbly, not responding, not communicating back to you. And we can label that as being passive or unmotivated. Let's think of that stress response. If you were to see a bear in the forest, or if you were to see a big angry dog bearing down at you, you then may either decide to fight to protect yourself, run away to protect yourself, or just freeze. And that is that stress response, our primal part in our brain, where our frontal lobe, the thinking part of our brain, actually shuts down. We just want to preserve life. So it's important for us to make sure that we understand what's really happening with individuals. So to learn a little bit more about this stress response, let's talk about adverse childhood experiences and how this fight, flight, or freeze and that toxic stress plays a role. About 30 years ago, there's a big study. They're still conducting this study now. Kaiser actually started looking at a group of patients, about 17,000 patients, that would come into care and they would get better and then they would have relapses. And so they administered some surveys, and what they found are these areas that listed on the slide here: household substance use or misuse, mental illness in the home, a parental separation, it could be a divorce or incarceration, intimate partner violence, and particularly violence against a mother, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, and sexual assault were big indicators in increased morbidity and mortality for individuals between the ages of 0 and 17. You may be asking yourself, 0? Wow, how can I have an early adversity if I'm not even born yet? What we do know is that trauma is transmitted to the unborn because that cortisol is bathing that brain in utero. And so if you have a mom who is experiencing sexual abuse, physical abuse, she's unhoused, she's stressed all the time about where she's going to eat, if she's using substances or in a home where there's a lot of mental illness, or perhaps she has mental illness herself, her unborn child is experiencing that as well. So what we know is that this early adversity and the hyper alertness of our cortisol response level, that really leads us to toxic stress. And that's that other trauma that I talked about.
I'm
Yes.
wondering if we could maybe just pause there for a moment, though, and
Sure.
think about what kind of ACEs Angela may have experienced. We're talking about childhood events, and we've talked about that Angela grew up in a home that she witnessed domestic violence, that she had her father was absent at periods. And so when we think about her experience from birth to adulthood and consider the ACEs and the impact on her now.
I think you're right about that. And you see how her early life experience is really flowing over to her own children. She's not with her children. There is a disruption in her relationship with her children. She's in and out of hospital. She's using substances herself. And so when we think about trauma, we think about ACEs, they're often intergenerational. Unless there is something, an intervention, we often pass those things on. You know, our kids live in families and they see this behavior happening and it begins to be normalized and changes their brain. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And if we don't understand that about Angela, we may miss that. We may just say she's got serious mental illness, she's got this schizoaffective disorder, and not really understand the complexity of her life experience. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. This slide, which brings us again to talk about our client, Angela, it talks about how early adversity and trauma, I really love this because it's a period and a pyramid and shows you how it affects us through the life course. So you see the ACEs on the bottom, affects neurodevelopment, relationships. We start having adopting behaviors that aren't healthy, drinking, smoking, eating the wrong foods, all those kinds of things, which end up in early disease and disability and ultimately death. So, just briefly, Deborah, can you talk about the impact of all of this on professionals and organizations?
Sure, and thank you for asking. I think that when we consider the impact of trauma on the individuals that we serve, as well as the impact that it has on us, we need to remember that it is very personal. There's no one image of trauma. And so I like this slide. I'm going to give you a really high level overview because it shows the different areas that trauma could be expressed, ourselves professionally, ourselves personally, and also the people that we work with. The emotional impact, how it's expressed by dysregulation, maybe by anxiety, maybe by numbness, and certainly the presence of it over a long time, and the impact could look like post-traumatic stress disorder, where we really see it come out, and the impact behaviorally. We may see things like substance use, like self-harm, alienation, people that matter to the individual. Physical, I think Karen's already talked about the impact that trauma has on our health and our wellness, risk for mortality and morbidity, the impact on that, certainly blood pressure and other health-related conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Cognitive, it impacts us on how we make memories, retrieve memories, how we feel connected to the environment around us, that fight or flight, right? Are we seeing what's going on? Are we distancing from it? Are we interacting with our environment? I'm going to put interpersonal and spiritual together for this, thinking about the relationships that we have with our families, with our community, with our peers, with people that matter to us. And often, trauma and adverse experiences disrupt those relationships with our community, whether it's a formal spiritual or religious organization. We talked about Angela. Angela is connected to her church. It's one of her strengths. She's more than just a person living with a mental health diagnosis. She's also a person who very much relates to her spiritual identity, and that's what's gotten her through some difficult times. Her experience of trauma may be impacting that relationship to a community that she feels connected to. And then certainly economically, it's hard to keep a job when you are disrupted by these experiences and the impact that it has on your day to day. So lots of different areas that may look different from person to person, provider to provider as well. So going back to what Karen mentioned earlier, again, thinking about those 3 E's, the events, the experiences, and the effects that trauma and adverse events may have on all of us. And so just continuing to think about, as you have a trauma-informed organization and you implement trauma-informed care, how you can support people like Angela, like other clients that you're working with, to help reduce some of those negative impacts.
Perfect. This is so beautiful to add on top of that. But I'm going to add another layer of this. We're going to talk a little bit about what do bias and stigma have to do with trauma. You know, a bias is the tendency or the inclination to prejudge individuals. And we do this all the time. We feel like this is such an important topic that we're going to develop a standalone presentation around this. But for today, it's our actions that prejudiced in favor or against something or someone, a person, an individual compared to another. You know, humans, by our nature, is we have biases and we make judgments, and that comes from the Stone Age of safety and not safety. Stigma is powerful, a social process, and so when we think about this, how we stereotype individuals, how we make judgments about them, that is an added layer onto someone like Angela, who comes to us with many challenges and many strengths. We want to just talk a little bit about sort of implicit or unconscious bias. Some of our biases are very conscious, but some of them are unconscious. We do them and we don't even know that we're doing them. And so thinking about this, for example, you know, I might move to a new neighborhood and seek out only people who look like me, who have the same activities that I am. And I may make judgments about other people that I don't know, that I may not feel safe about, that I've heard from my family or seen on TV. And so it's really important that we take into consideration ways in which care respondents may have been subject to these kinds of bias and this kind of implicit biases and stigmas, and how harmful those things can be. But more about that in upcoming presentations. We're going to add a beautiful piece now about culture and trauma-informed care, how it's so important. This is a lovely slide that talks about all of the multiple things that really make up culture in individuals. We've talked a lot about the negative impacts of trauma, implicit bias and stigma, and how it can affect our care respondents. Let's talk about a trauma-informed way to sort of look at that, these essential components. Implementing a trauma-informed care approach makes sure that we incorporate, as we work with our care respondents, their language. The fact that Angela is multilingual is a strength, and that's very important. She's got customs we want to learn about that come from her family, that she was from another country, behaviors and rituals, her faith. She does go to church, the kinds of food she eats. All of this are things that make her unique in who she is. Art and music, the attitudes and beliefs. These are all important pieces that we want to incorporate into her care plan and incorporate in how we think about supporting Angela as she moves through the care process. All of these things around culture and bias and all of these other things now lead us to another concept, which is still another added layer of intersectionality. What am I talking about? Many of you've heard that term, intersectionality. It was originally coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. And so it really talks about how individuals are multi-layered. I like to think of it sort of as an onion. You know, we have Angela, who is Latina, who has multiple cultural expectations. She's got her religion. She's an immigrant. These are all layers of who she is as a human being. Has she worked an hourly job? Has a different piece of it. She's a mother. She's a family member. She's a cousin, a sister, a friend. She's part of a community. She's living with a mental illness that at times can be very debilitating for her. So these are all of the things that we have to think about as a sum of a human being. And on top of that are the complexities of bias and implicit bias and racism and being disconnected. So when we talk about stigma and implicit bias, this is how this affects our care recipients and respondents. We want to think about preventative care versus complex care. Is it comprehensive or interprofessional training? This is what makes the work so difficult, because from an organizational perspective, we've got to address all of these things. The chronicity of having a serious mental illness and schizoaffective disorder, co-occurring issues on top of that. Angela could have a myriad of health conditions that complicate her mental health condition. Is she using substances that are exacerbating her health care? So this really is a time-intensive population and high need, and that's what really adds to the difficulty of providing services. You know, before we move on, I want to talk about some ideas in action, and I'm going to bring in my colleague so that we can discuss this. As you think about this, Deborah, you know, how can you approach Angela from a trauma-informed lens, from an organizational perspective? What are some things that organizations should be considering?
Yeah, thank you for that question. When I think about how we could support and work with someone like Angela, and certainly taking a person-centered position, when we meet Angela, are we asking what are her preferred names and pronouns? Am I approaching her wearing an ID badge? Am I wearing my name and pronoun? Are there people in uniform? Am I maybe engaging her in nonverbal ways? Perhaps Angela is listening to music. Can I just join her and hear the music that she's enjoying? I think that there's lots of ways to consider her experience, to ask open-ended questions, to put our prejudgment aside, and to, again, going back to what you had said earlier, what happened to you versus what's wrong. And so I think that there's lots of ways that we can think about that intersectionality as a female, as a mother, as a person who is living with a mental illness, who has strengths, who has goals and preferences, asking about those goals. What would you like to see in part of your care plan? Where would you like to receive services? Where do you see yourself in a few months from now? And so really creating a dialogue that's considering her as a whole person.
I think you're right. What you're really talking about is centering Angela and her needs. Let's talk a little about more. We're going to go a little deeper into organizational considerations for integrating care. But before I do that, I want to just bring front and center of how organizations unintentionally re-traumatize individuals. Re-traumatization can happen when, we can trigger people, circumstances that can make people go activate that system, that cortisol system. Consider ways in which your organization may be unintentionally or intentionally re-traumatizing people that we don't really think about. It's really that experience of reliving a situation. When you come into your organization, is it well lit? Do they see themselves on the walls? Are people greeting them? Do people speak to them? When we re-traumatize an individual, their thoughts, their physical signs and symptoms, behaviors and emotions are all activated. So, for example, Angela has experienced domestic violence in her home, and she may be re-traumatized if she walks into an organization and on the organization there's a violent thing happening on the screen, or there's too much noise, or there's more men in the room, and there's not a lot of safety, or people feeling that she feels safe. So these are all things that we want to make sure we think about. And so I'm going to ask my colleague Deborah to talk a little bit more about organizations, because they have to be intentional in addressing re-traumatization, not re-traumatizing.
Absolutely. I think it's for an organization to provide trauma-informed care, it's also about a commitment of creating an organization, an environment that's trauma-informed, and thinking about it in terms of the organization's culture, the policies that are used, the procedures, how do you engage with people who are receiving care, and then certainly the daily practices that we consider. And so that's from frontline staff to administrators, clinical staff, security officers, anyone who is working in that environment, understanding that people that we serve have experienced trauma, and that people are working in the organization may also be experiencing their own from their personal lives and from the work that they do. Why don't we go to the next slide, please? So let's talk a little bit about what it means to have a trauma-informed approach. And there's a lot on this slide. I'll leave it to you to read the details later. I think that there are some significant principles, though, to talk about. Safety is primary. Karen mentioned, is this an environment that's well lit? Are there doors that are open? Is there natural lighting? Is there signage that's in the language that the individuals speak? If there is security, do you make a choice that that person is not in uniform? Or are we creating a place that feels institutional? So I think to create an environment, and if possible, to engage the people who are receiving services in the creation of that environment. Can they help pick out the artwork that's on the walls? So creating a space that just feels safe. Creating an atmosphere that feels trustworthy. Are you talking to folks in language that they understand? Are you explaining procedures? Are you being direct about what's happening? We're talking about the CARE Act. It's a little bit complicated. Are we taking the time to go through and explain the details of each of those hearings, of each of the treatment plans, and the agreement versus a plan? Excuse me. So talking to folks who are receiving services in a way that's respectful and considerate and detailed about what they are experiencing. Are you thinking about bringing in, and I hope you are, peers and natural supports, and people with lived experience of behavioral health, people with lived experience of substance use recovery, peers who have been through or are going through the Care Act process, and then certainly natural and chosen supports. Are we considering bringing in friends, family members, people that matter to the individual that you're serving? Certainly collaboration among not only recipients, but staff. Are you hearing the voices? Is there are people represented? Do the people who are working in your organization sound like the people that you're serving? So are we having staff feedback, and are we having client and recipient feedback to inform the organization's policies? Something as simple as, are you ensuring that forms that are signed are provided in multiple languages? And then certainly empowerment. Do folks feel heard? Do they feel seen? Are their preferences, their goals, their wishes recognized? Are their strengths considered? We've talked about Angela. Angela is more than just her diagnosis. She's a complicated person with lots of intersectionality. She's a mother. She's Latina. She's got these experiences. She's connected to her church. Are we thinking about what matters and empowering people like Angela who we're serving? And then again, the cultural, the historic, gender, sexuality, how are all of the expressions of where that individual comes from, are they recognized in the services that are being provided? So let's think about how, as an organization, you can apply these principles in your everyday work. Think about folks like Angela that we're serving. Think about the environment and the experience that she and others may encounter, the culture of your organization. Are you promoting respect? Are you using person-centered language? Are you considering the individual as for their strengths and for more than just the diagnosis or the concerns that you have? Are you keeping their accomplishments and celebrating those victories foremost? Think about the folks that we're working with as experts in their own care, their family members who know them, their friends, their natural supports, their peers. And so really creating a culture that's based on trauma-informed care. The practices of every day, ensuring that services are available in languages that people feel comfortable speaking, their preferred language, thinking about using person-centered language, moving away from diagnoses and moving towards people, using preferred pronouns and names. Maybe some of the considering how you introduce yourself with your pronouns and names. Just that gives a message of safety, that it's okay to consider these different issues. Are you hiring staff and bringing people out who look and sound and feel like the community that's being served? Is there signage in multiple languages, and are people represented in the artwork on the walls to really show that you understand these various areas that people are coming from and that intersectionality that Karen talked about earlier? I think when we consider policies, that's a big one. How you design services. Are we being flexible? Are we understanding that people have experienced trauma, and we might need to slow down a little to explain things? We might need to go through a couple of the rules that we implement a few times. Can we be flexible with appointments? Are we ensuring that people can keep doors open, that we're providing privacy while still allowing people to feel safe in our environments? And then the procedures, again, making sure that you really are taking the time to understand the individual's needs, their strengths, helping them to prepare for the process that they are encountering through the CARE Act or through a care agreement. Are we explaining the courtroom, the various roles, maybe showing people pictures, maybe walking over with them to allow them to see the environment or see the court before they're there? So considering lots of ways that you can engage people outside of the traditional behavioral health system that we've created, a very complicated system. So rethinking the kind of services and the approach that you have to folks that you are encountering. I think, why don't we continue? And Karen, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how we can prevent our organizations from re-traumatizing.
Right. I'm not sure if we can do 100% of not traumatizing people. We never really can be sure of what's going to trigger somebody or re-traumatize them. What we can do is do the best to our ability to mitigate it and to acknowledge that re-traumatization can feel like opening in a wound, right, that has not quite healed, and recognizing that care respondents are experiencing this re-traumatization and having tools in our toolbox to help mitigate those or to reduce those symptoms. So we want to always appreciate the impact of the original trauma if we know what it is. You can't underestimate what people have been through. We don't really understand that because people in response to trauma is very individual. Connect with people and make sure that it's okay, that they know that they're in a safe place and that you're there to support them. We can help from re-traumatizing if we pay attention to our own needs around resilience, and so that we are bringing our best selves to the workplace. Sometimes inadvertently, it's not the organization itself, but it's the provider who's got a lot of stuff going on that they haven't necessarily addressed. So taking care of ourselves, self-care is really, really important so that you can really respond early, think ahead, plan with your client so that re-traumatization doesn't happen. And when you see things that really need to be addressed, to bring those forward to leadership so that you can make the changes that need to happen. So let's talk a little bit about some strategies of a trauma-informed approach. This is a simple, straightforward checklist of sorts of strategies to apply a trauma-informed approach and will help to reduce re-traumatization. So you want to anticipate and to reduce traumas and triggers, right? So that means we've got to know who Angela is. You've got to know to the best of your ability who the person in front of you is. Be interested and curious about their cultures so that you can sort of layer on and incorporate and be humble about an individual's culture. And then focus on sort of cross-cultural communication. So we'll talk a little bit more about this a little bit later, but making sure that we are communicating in the way that people can understand, and always, 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 along with a trauma-informed care, have a strength-based approach. Everybody in front of us has strengths, and that's what we need to really leverage. And then to use our trauma-informed listening skills. Are we using our motivational interviewing skills of open-ended questions, of reflective listening, all of those sorts of things? And then finally, just holding space for people. And what am I talking about? Sometimes that's just the therapeutic use of self, of just sitting there and listening and letting people tell their story. One of the things that we use that sometimes is really helpful is the respect framework. And respect it starts with that very first one. We're going to go to the next slide and talk about the respect framework. So we're going to understand how respect is shown to individuals, and that can be different by age, ethnicity, race, culture, all of those things. Embrace that humility. Understand that we're all different, and to be curious about others, as I just said. Recognize the importance of social and cultural context of how people are living. Often our frame of reference is very different than the realities of the people that we serve. Learn your care respondents' preferences. So you do a lot of that in your relationship and trust building. Empathize. Use our empathy to make sure that we are hearing and sort of trying to the best of our experience, having a shared understanding that people feel free and non-judged when they talk to you about their experiences. And so the concerns and fears, sometimes when we're working with people, we need to make sure that we address their concerns, understanding that people can be triggered, and try to come up with solutions and triggers and give not triggers, but avenues of ways to help people calm themselves down. And my colleague Deborah was so good at preparing, have them go to the courtroom, give them the offer that maybe they don't even, if it's too traumatizing, they don't have to go to the care court. They can still have somebody go in their stead and still represent them. I love the fact that in this respect framework, the very bottom one is trust and having that therapeutic alliance. And it's not something that's automatically given to you. It is really earned. And it can be very challenging for our care respondents because, trust me, you're not the first person that they have encountered that has made some promises to them who may not been able to, for array of reasons, not to follow through. And so it's really, really important that we honor the therapeutic alliance and continue to build trust and be completely transparent to the best of our abilities with our care respondents so that they know we really are going to do what we can for them. Now as we move forward, I just want to have some ideas in action. Let's talk about this. So I'm going to bring my colleague in here with me. What do you see are the key considerations for an organization? Again, I know you talked a lot about it, but if we were going to focus it around culture and policies and practices, what would you say are just essential for us to be thinking about as we come to the close of our presentation here, Deborah?
Yes, good question. And I probably would turn that question to the organizations. What do they see as the essential things that they could do? We might walk away from this discussion with 3 things that come to mind, right? Each person who's listening might remember 3 things, and maybe it's about safety. I really think a physical environment is essential. Again, we've talked about well-lit, natural lighting, getting rid of institutional colors, artwork that reflects people who are served. I think that's really important. I think connecting at a person-centered language and approach, hearing individuals, empowering people to be participants in their own service, their own choices, who represents them, who's involved in their care is essential. And then I think just really reconsidering or reflecting on what policies and procedures are put into place. Do they support and uplift and empower people that we are aiming to serve and aiming to support? So I would encourage agencies to think through these choices that they have to become trauma informed, really check those boxes that you mentioned earlier. Are they hitting all of the marks and creating an environment for people who can grow and thrive?
I think you're right. And making places that people want to come to, that they feel safe. And with that, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to my other colleague, Patricia, to take us to the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rose and Dr. Hill, for sharing with us your experiences and sharing concrete examples of how we can incorporate a trauma-informed approach into the work that we do. The goal of this training was for you to better be able to describe the types of trauma that can impact individuals. And Deborah and Karen talked about vicarious and secondary trauma, how our care participants might have experienced that, and how you could have experienced that yourselves as people providing support. And then integrate or identify some of those strategies for integrating trauma-informed care into your approach. Deborah and Karen summarized those nicely just now, but how can you approach an individual with empathy, center their experience and their needs, and then identify those key considerations for organizations for integrating trauma-informed care. How can you look at your policies, your procedures, your practices, and the culture that you have in your physical spaces and in your organization, and how can you incorporate a trauma-informed approach into the work that you do? Just some next steps here, and we want to highlight some resources for you. We put a lot of resources on the CARE Act website for you. You can also submit TA questions if you have questions about this or other trainings, and then also highlight those upcoming trainings. So the part 2 in this series for implementation teams, especially BH agencies, will be incorporating trauma-informed care into the process. We'll look at the process flow and brainstorm different ways that you can incorporate these strategies into that process. And then the third section will be focusing on your needs as care providers, as people providing support to this population. What do you need to make sure that the workforce is sustainable, and that we're taking a trauma-informed approach towards your experience and making sure you don't experience burnout in intervening beforehand. And also I wanted to re-highlight those trainings that we did, the Trauma-Informed Care Series for volunteer supporters. And those resources, similar content to what we've presented to you all today, but really focus on the perspective of volunteer supporters. Again, if you have questions, please reach out to us. You could go to our website and submit questions or TA requests. Also, always feel free to reach out to that email address. And then you can find linked into this in this presentation different resources on trauma-informed care if you're interested in learning more and in figuring out ways so you can do this not only for care but across your programming. Again, thank you for attending this training, and please reach out if you have any questions.